In the South Pacific, distance is not measured only in miles. It is measured in days without sight of another vessel, in the slow repetition of waves against rock, and in the long intervals between human footprints. Many islands in this region appear on maps as small shapes surrounded by blank space. From the air, they are green and contained. From the water, they are difficult to approach and easy to pass without noticing. The island in question lay far from regular shipping routes. It was uninhabited at the time, without docks, buildings, or maintained paths. Its coastline rose sharply in places, formed by volcanic rock worn smooth by centuries of weather. Inland, vegetation grew dense and uneven. There were no planted crops, no cleared ground, and no signs of permanent settlement. Fresh water was present, but not immediately visible from the shore. Weather followed a steady rhythm. Days were hot and bright. Nights cooled quickly. Rain arrived without warning and left just as abruptly. Seasonal storms were common, though not constant. From the beach, the horizon appeared uninterrupted in every direction. Nothing about the island suggested urgency or threat. It existed as it had for years, quiet, isolated, and indifferent to whoever might arrive without a plan to leave. The person stranded on this island was Alexander Selkirk, a Scottish sailor, whose experience would later inspire the literary figure of Robinson Crusoe. In 1704, Selkirk served aboard the privateering vessel Cinque Ports, captained by Thomas Stradling. He had spent years at sea, navigating the trade routes of the South Pacific and the waters near South America. Like many sailors of the era, he was accustomed to isolation and hardship, but always within the framework of a crew and a ship. The sea was familiar, land without companionship was less so. Selkirk was in his late 20s at the time. He was known for his competence in navigation and seamanship. Before the voyage, he had completed training typical for Scottish mariners: knotwork, chart reading, and handling small vessels in open waters. He was not a stranger to risk, but he had learned to measure it against human limits and environmental realities. His prior experience included extended periods away from ports, but never longer than the voyage's expected duration, and always with the assurance of a vessel nearby. The Cinque Ports had embarked on a privateering mission. Its route would take it to the Pacific coast of South America, where the crew hoped to intercept Spanish merchant ships. Such missions were long, fraught with navigational hazards, and often carried the threat of conflict. Selkirk's decision-making was shaped by these pressures. Discipline on board was strict, though occasionally contested. Officers expected obedience, and disagreements could escalate quickly in the confined quarters of a wooden ship at sea. During the voyage, Selkirk grew increasingly concerned about the seaworthiness of the vessel. By late 1704, he judged the Cinque Ports unsafe for continued operations. The ship had sustained damage during prior storms, and repairs at sea were minimal. Supplies were limited, and the captain insisted on pressing onward rather than seeking a secure harbor. Selkirk weighed the risks of remaining on the vessel against the uncertainty of the islands in the region. The island that would become his temporary home was part of the Juan Fernandez archipelago, situated several hundred miles off the Chilean coast. It had been charted by Europeans but was largely uninhabited. Selkirk knew of its existence from maritime maps and prior accounts, and he understood that it contained freshwater springs and some vegetation capable of sustaining small animals. He had no expectation of comfort or abundance, but he recognized it as a safer alternative to a ship falling apart at sea. His decision to leave the ship was deliberate. On February 1, 1704, Selkirk chose to be put ashore. He took with him only what he could carry: a musket, a few supplies, and essential personal items. He did not overpack. The weight of survival required selectivity. He had basic tools and weapons sufficient for hunting, but little in terms of long-term security. The choice was guided by both immediate concern for personal safety and his judgment that, isolated, he might survive. Selkirk's background in self-sufficiency was limited. He had learned skills aboard ship: fire-making, basic cooking, and rationing, but he had no formal training in wilderness survival. He was, in effect, relying on resourcefulness, observation, and persistence. Prior seafarers who had faced shipwrecks or marooning had often failed, but there were precedents for survival on islands with fresh water and game. Selkirk's awareness of these examples shaped his expectations and preparations. The context of his abandonment was neither romantic nor heroic. It was a rational assessment of risk, informed by experience, knowledge of geography, and an understanding of the limitations of a damaged vessel. His isolation would be profound, but he was not unprepared. He carried with him the expectation of challenge and the knowledge that time alone, without rescue, would test every skill he possessed. Once Selkirk stepped ashore on the island of Massa Tierra, the situation became irreversible. The captain of the Cinque Ports did not intend to return for him, and the distance from mainland ports rendered immediate rescue impossible. The act of disembarking was final. The beach was empty, save for driftwood and the occasional seabird. Behind him, the ship receded into the horizon, a reminder that he was no longer part of its crew or structure. Ahead, the island stretched inland with no clear path or sign of human habitation. The initial hours were a mixture of observation and calculation. Selkirk explored the immediate coastline, taking note of freshwater streams, shelter options, and locations where small animals might appear. The slopes were steep in places, and the undergrowth thick. He identified areas that were accessible and areas where climbing would be difficult. While nothing about the island appeared hostile in the first hours, he understood that scarcity and exposure were latent threats. He constructed rudimentary markers to help navigate the terrain and claimed a small section of land near a spring. His first camp was temporary, designed to last only until he could assess resources and identify a more secure location. The decision to remain on the island was no longer theoretical, survival depended on methodical use of limited supplies. Any misstep, excessive exertion, injury, or misjudgment of available food, would have immediate consequences. This moment marked the end of Selkirk's previous life and the beginning of a prolonged engagement with the island's environment. The isolation was complete. Communication with other humans was impossible, and the maritime routes that had once connected him to the broader world now offered only distance and uncertainty. He was, in practical terms, entirely responsible for his survival. No storms had yet arrived. No immediate danger threatened him physically. Yet the psychological weight of permanence began to emerge subtly. The understanding that he would remain here for an extended period, the exact duration unknown, was the first form of tension. The island was quiet, indifferent, and uninhabited, and this quiet would dominate the months ahead. Selkirk's survival depended on establishing routines and learning the environment with precision. The island offered few resources that were immediately accessible, but those that were available could sustain life if used carefully. Freshwater streams flowed intermittently, often shaded by dense foliage. Small mammals, wild goats, and seabirds provided occasional protein, while edible roots, berries, and leaves supplemented his diet. His daily existence became a process of observing, testing, and adapting to these resources. Shelter was his first priority. Selkirk selected a location near the freshwater spring, on a slope that provided both drainage and protection from the prevailing winds. He cleared an area of undergrowth and used rocks, logs, and palm fronds to construct a shelter. The structure was simple, a lean-to that protected him from rain and offered some insulation against nighttime humidity. It required continual maintenance. Storms occasionally damaged the roof or washed debris into the camp, but he repaired these immediately to prevent exposure. Fire was essential for cooking and warmth, and Selkirk relied on friction-based methods to ignite tinder. He preserved dry leaves, bark, and driftwood, storing them under rocks to prevent moisture from extinguishing them. Cooking was functional, small portions of meat roasted over coals, roots boiled when possible, and occasional fish cleaned and dried for later consumption. The fire also served as a signal, though he had no expectation that a passing ship would see it. Its primary purpose was practical survival, not communication. Hunting and gathering required discipline. Selkirk fashioned basic tools from available materials. Rocks served as hammers and cutting implements, bones and shells as knives. He set traps for small animals, monitored bird nesting areas, and, where feasible, captured fish along the shoreline. The diet was monotonous, but adequate. He rationed carefully, mindful that periods of scarcity were inevitable. Knowledge of the island's natural cycles, tides, bird migrations, and seasonal fruiting, became central to his strategy. Clothing was maintained using patching techniques, and leather from goats was repurposed for footwear and protection. Hygiene was managed by bathing in streams and keeping the living area as clean as possible. These practices were not for comfort alone, they prevented infections and reduced the risk of disease. Selkirk understood that small lapses could have outsized consequences in isolation. Time was measured by tasks, not days. He developed a routine, mornings spent exploring and hunting, afternoons maintaining the shelter and fire, evenings preparing food and monitoring water sources. Sleep occurred in the shelter, often interrupted by sounds of wildlife or rain. The structure of daily life provided stability and reduced the psychological strain of isolation. Repetition became a form of control over an environment that was otherwise indifferent. Observation was continuous. Selkirk noted weather patterns, the movement of animals, and the behavior of tides. He tracked seasonal changes, adjusting his strategies accordingly. During rainy periods, he reinforced shelters and increased stored food. During dry periods, he prioritized water collection and rationing. Each adjustment was methodical, based on experience and necessity rather than instinct alone. Selkirk also used isolation to refine his own mental resilience. Without companions, he relied on reflection and methodical planning. He documented his activities in a rough ledger, using the equivalent of tally marks on wood or stone to measure days and track resources. He observed cause and effect closely. Overhunting one area led to scarcity, ignoring maintenance led to shelter collapse. Learning from these patterns was essential to continued survival. Health management was crucial. Selkirk treated minor injuries with natural remedies when possible. Cuts were cleaned with fresh water, bruises rested until mobility returned. He avoided unnecessary risk, recognizing that a single injury could compromise his ability to hunt or maintain shelter. Physical activity was balanced with conservation of energy. Survival required endurance, not speed or excess. Social isolation was mitigated by routine and engagement with the environment. Selkirk's focus on tasks, observation, and experimentation created structure and reduced mental strain. He noted patterns in animal behavior, mapped portions of the island, and created markers for navigation. Even small discoveries, a new edible plant or a hidden freshwater pool, provided psychological reinforcement. These were incremental validations of his understanding and ability to adapt. Over the months, Selkirk refined his strategies. He constructed additional shelters in case of storm damage, developed more efficient hunting methods, and improved food storage. He learned to recognize the signs of incoming weather, avoiding exposure during storms. Knowledge of the terrain increased his mobility and confidence. What began as improvisation became systematic management of an ecosystem on a micro scale. Interactions with wildlife were pragmatic. Goats were hunted selectively to prevent depletion. Birds were observed for nesting patterns, and eggs collected with care. Marine life along the coast provided additional nutrition, though he needed to account for tides and currents. Each engagement with the environment required attentiveness. Mistakes were costly and could reduce survival chances immediately. Selkirk's survival was neither heroic nor exceptional in terms of physical feats. It was methodical. The skills that allowed him to persist were grounded in observation, adaptability, and discipline. Each day presented a series of tasks that, if completed carefully, maintained his life. Mistakes were instructive rather than catastrophic, but they reinforced the constant presence of risk. As months passed, the island became familiar. Trails were established, hunting grounds mapped, and shelters fortified. Selkirk's body and mind adapted to this isolated rhythm. He maintained vigilance, but over time, his awareness of scarcity and environmental hazards became normalized. The island imposed limits, but within those limits, he developed competence and endurance. Survival was a continuous negotiation with the terrain, weather, and available resources. By the end of the first year, Selkirk had created a sustainable pattern. Food sources were managed, shelters maintained, and water secured. He had learned to read the island as a network of signals, the behavior of animals, the wind in the trees, and the shifting tides. These signals informed decisions that were critical to remaining alive. Isolation had imposed rigor, structure, and clarity. Life was reduced to essential interactions between human and environment. Despite his careful routines, Selkirk's isolation was not without consequence. The passage of months introduced subtle but persistent strains on both body and mind. Malnutrition, though mitigated by careful foraging and hunting, sometimes left him weak, particularly during periods when animal or plant resources were scarce. The diet, heavily reliant on goat meat and limited vegetation, provided calories but lacked variety. Vitamins and minerals were consumed unevenly, and fatigue became a recurring factor in daily labor. Injury presented intermittent threats. Selkirk occasionally cut himself while butchering goats or preparing tools. Small wounds required immediate attention to prevent infection. He learned to wash cuts in fresh water, apply pressure, and allow natural healing, but the island offered no medical materials beyond what he could improvise. Sprains, abrasions, and exposure to sharp volcanic rock became part of the daily calculus. Each incident reminded him of the fragility of life in isolation. Weather remained a constant variable. Storms, though infrequent, were severe. Heavy rains could flood the shelter, sweep away food stores, and erode pathways. Wind often toppled weakened branches and occasionally stripped the roof of his lean-to. Selkirk adapted by reinforcing shelters and building drainage channels, but each storm increased the labor required to maintain survival. Time, in this sense, was measured not only in days but in cumulative effort against environmental pressures. Mental strain was significant. Solitude, without the occasional human interaction, altered perception of time. Days and weeks blurred. Seasonal markers, fruiting plants, animal behaviors, and weather patterns, became essential temporal anchors. Selkirk coped through methodical tasks, maintaining shelters, hunting, collecting water, and mapping the terrain. These activities provided structure, but monotony was inevitable. The quiet that had initially been neutral grew heavier, emphasizing the absence of companionship and the permanence of isolation. Selkirk's understanding of risk evolved. He became cautious in climbing steep slopes, more deliberate in handling fire and tools, and meticulous in rationing food and water. Every action carried immediate consequences. Mistakes could mean injury, loss of critical resources, or exposure. His attention to detail increased over time, as the cost of error became clearer with each passing month. Encounters with wildlife were occasionally destructive. Goats competed with him for limited grazing areas, forcing him to adjust hunting patterns. Birds sometimes raided stored food, and insects invaded sleeping areas. Selkirk responded by creating storage methods and barriers, learning to anticipate natural behaviors and integrate that knowledge into survival strategies. Despite these adaptations, losses occurred. Not all traps were successful. Injuries healed slowly. Occasional storms destroyed food caches. Even small failures amplified the tension of survival. The rhythm of life remained constant, but the margin for error narrowed. The island's isolation magnified every scarcity and every setback. Over time, Selkirk's presence on the island became almost entirely measured by these cycles of labor, observation, and repair. Physical decline and environmental challenges were tempered only by the discipline he maintained. Yet, at the edges of endurance, the quiet knowledge persisted that the island could outlast him if he faltered. Survival was possible, but only through vigilance, repetition, and adaptation. After more than 4 years on the island, Alexander Selkirk's isolation ended not through his own intervention, but by the arrival of another vessel. In February 1709, the privateer Duke, commanded by Woodes Rogers, reached the Juan Fernandez Islands. Selkirk had maintained his shelters, fires, and markers, but he had not anticipated human contact. When the ship anchored offshore, the routine that had structured his life for years was interrupted. The first contact was cautious and deliberate. Selkirk was initially observed from a distance. His musket and survival tools were visible, and the crew understood that he had existed independently for an extended period. Rogers' men approached carefully, aware of the unpredictability of a human who had lived alone for years. Selkirk was convinced of their peaceful intent only after initial verification and gradual interaction. Rescue was practical rather than celebratory. Selkirk's belongings were gathered, and the shelters were left in place. The process emphasized functionality. He would return to the vessel and reintegrate into a seafaring environment, but with no fanfare marking his survival. Food, clothing, and basic care were provided, correcting deficiencies accrued over years of self-reliance. The transition was measured and subdued. Selkirk's survival had been confirmed by the endurance of his routines, the reliability of natural resources, and the disciplined application of skill and observation. His extraction from the island closed a chapter of isolation quietly, without dramatization, leaving the environment intact and his experience preserved as a record of methodical survival. Alexander Selkirk's survival on Masa Tierra remains a singular example of human adaptability under prolonged isolation. The island imposed limits that were absolute: finite food, limited shelter options, and exposure to weather. Selkirk met these challenges through observation, disciplined routines, and continual adjustment to environmental feedback. His endurance was neither romanticized nor extraordinary in spectacle. It was methodical, quiet, and grounded in practical understanding. Historically, his experience influenced maritime practices and became a reference point for accounts of shipwreck and marooning. It demonstrated the importance of preparation, resourcefulness, and mental resilience. Selkirk's survival illustrated that extended isolation could be sustained through structured engagement with the natural environment, careful management of resources, and adaptation to temporal and seasonal rhythms. In the years that followed, his story persisted not because of heroics, but because it documented human persistence in conditions devoid of human society. The island remained, indifferent, as it had before and would continue to exist long after, a silent witness to the passage of time and the endurance of one solitary individual.